Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Mists of Pandaria retrospective. I'm going to start off the second episode with an admission. I've lied to all of you. This is not part 2 out of 2, this is 2 out of 3. I wrote the first episode before I really scoped out the second one, and well, Mists of Pandaria is just such a rich expansion that there's no way it could all be covered in so little time. This patch cycle brought tremendous change to the game, and experimentation aside, there was just a ton of content added, more than we had really seen before, and for the most part, more than we've really seen since. When we last left off, things were not looking great. Subscribers were beginning to depart in droves. With the launch not really having an amazing numerical success, therefore the burden rested on the patch content, and all eyes were on Blizzard to deliver. Just 2 months after Mists of Pandaria launched, patch 5.1 released. This was actually amazing at the time, especially when the patch turned out to be so content-rich. It really wasn't the norm to have something like that, and it would not be for another 4 years with patch 7.1 of Legion that Blizzard would do a similar thing, giving us a big patch close to launch. The initial story of Mists of Pandaria covered the early steps of each faction's elite. Sent there on an airship at great speed, we were supposedly far ahead of the actual armies. The job of patch 5.1 was to bring the war to Pandaria, and it did a pretty damn good job. The main content of this patch played out in 2 different ways. After a short initial quest with our faction leader, we established Lion's Landing and Domination Point. Then, as our forces did battle in the no man's land in between either base, players would have daily quests to do, and it was mostly special forces kinda stuff. Destroying supplies, killing officers, general hampering of war efforts, that kind of thing. And while the fantasy of these quests was kind of cool, they were kind of repetitive when you get down to it, even with Mists of Pandaria's big innovation of having a larger pool of potential daily quests than would spawn in a given day. Now, this was present for every faction in Mists, but it didn't really create the feeling of variety that the developers perhaps hoped for. As we tore our way through the dailies, we would, of course, get more and more reputation with the 2 new factions that came in with this patch, and here is where Blizzard did something great. There was a decently long set of quests that would be unlocked as you gained rep with the factions, and this meant that every few days you would have a new bit of story to do. Now, in hindsight, I think this was a very effective way of doing things. Unlocking the story was a reward, something that actually motivated you to keep on playing through the daily quest content. Now, in today's world, similar quests, they're just handed to you on a weekly basis, rather than be something that you unlock via playing the game. So that certainly was a strength of patch 5.1. And as for the story content itself, it was a cut above what we had previously seen in the game. It got so many things right, and it managed to do that without fancy cinematics, gimmicks, anything really like that. It was just pretty damn good, solid storytelling that appealed to the core faction identity that players had really grown to love as they played the game more and more. And that meant that they were telling a story that you were basically already invested in. So it went down like this. Garrosh wanted every possible advantage in this coming war, and he eventually found out about the Divine Bell. This was a Mogu artifact that would send friendly warriors into a frenzy, strike fear in the hearts of the enemies, all that sort of spooky stuff. But there was a problem for him. The Night Elves, well, they already found it and took it to Darnassus. So, Horde forces managed to recapture the artifact, but in doing so, they led the Alliance to believe that it was carried out by the Sunreavers. Enraged at the apparent betrayal, Jaina ordered and personally led the Purge of Dalaran, basically slaughtering everyone who didn't surrender immediately and imprisoning those who did. This was a humongous political mistake. Lorthamar, the leader of the Blood Elves, was at the time trying to cut a deal with Varian and the Alliance so that the Blood Elves could switch sides, because guess what? They thought Garrosh was being a bit of a dick to everyone and was doing some spooky stuff. Now, back on Pandaria, Garrosh did eventually get his hands on the Divine Bell. Anduin went to confront him, and, well, this showdown was a pretty cool little event, nearly killed Anduin, but it did destroy the bell, denying Garrosh a key asset. And overall, it was just a really good, well-told story. Now, this also brought some new scenarios into the game, and these were heavily focused on this faction conflict, with the patch adding 2 for each faction, plus a scenario that was available for both. Now, while the scenarios, they weren't great, it was undeniably a pretty large amount of content. Actually, one of the Horde scenarios is particularly noteworthy. It covers the assassination attempt on Vol'jin by the Kor'kron forces under the direct orders of Garrosh, which is something that we will come back to later. Now, as you've probably noticed, dailies were a core part of this patch, and that means that it did contribute to the perception of there just being a massive amount of content that you had to do every day, that you just felt obligated to do, and that also meant that alt progression was kind of out of the question. Well, patch 5.1 partially fixed this problem by adding in grand commendations. Purchasable at revered reputation, these would increase rep gains account-wide with the faction by 100%. Now, not only did this, make that push to Exalted a bit easier, but more importantly, it made it far nicer on alts, and in my view this went a long way to solving the problem, even though I do think in hindsight it was a bit of an overblown problem, because you didn't really need all the reputations at Exalted. Now, even though it was soon after launch, it was still a patch of experimentation. Blizzard added the item upgrade system, which would allow players to upgrade the item level of most bits of gear. Now, these upgrades, well, they were pricey enough, especially, because VP was something that was on a weekly cap, but this system, it would give you a reason to always cap your VP. It pretty much, sure, was a bit grindy, right? But it did make, say, doing dungeons all the time continuously motivating, which is something that, say, in Warlords of Draenor didn't happen. So even though the dungeons were quite easy, they were actually ran really throughout Mists of Pandaria, and it was systems like the Valor points and the item upgrades that led to that being the case. And then finally, and also on the topic of experimentation, they added the Brawlers Guild. This allowed players to fight solo bosses of increasing difficulty, and it really was a fantastic bit of side content to do for the sake of cosmetic rewards and prestige. It also had some really cool social elements that were implemented, leading to this sort of spectating game, and it really did feel like a secret club, doubly so in the early days because it was kind of rare enough to have an invite early on. Then patch 5.1 also added new stages to the legendary quest line, with players getting a new prismatic socket on their weapon. Now, I didn't really cover the legendary quest line that much previously, so basically I'll do it now. Our arrival in Pandaria brings us into contact with Rathian, the uncorrupted son of Deathwing, who of course we offed in the past expansion. Now, we of course saved him as an egg back in Cataclysm, and then rogues were a bit more involved with him with their legendary quest. Now, he was very interested in the conflict that was playing out across the continent, and the player was pretty much recruited as his champion. In return for helping him out, we would get some pretty damn sweet loot, which is a fair trade for any WoW player. For the most part, these quests didn't really involve much content, and they were mainly based around mob grinding, and really something you'd be doing anyway with the reputation system, and then you'd also have to sometimes collect raid items with RNG drops. That was certainly one of the more frustrating elements of the legendary quest. It's definitely something that we will be talking quite a bit more about as this video rolls on though. But overall, when you look at it, patch 5.1 was a fantastic patch. It brought a lot of new content, it advanced the storyline in a very effective way, and it did address some of the complaints that Mists of Pandaria had at launch. Not too long after patch 5.1 released, 5.2 was already on the PTR, and then we found out, boom, it would come out in March. This would be Mists of Pandaria's first big major patch, and an example of Mists' tick-tock patch cycle, where we would see a small, odd-numbered patch followed up by a large, even-numbered patch. Patch 5.2 brought us to the Isle of Thunder, a storm-covered island that was the home to Lei Shen, the Thunder King. So the story here is the desperate Zandalari trolls were allied with the Mogu to bring back this long-dead tyrant and pretty much find a place at his side. After all, things were not looking good for the trolls. Their island was literally sinking into the sea at the time. This patch is often thought of as being one of the best that the game has ever had, and for very, very good reason. Now, the narrative latched onto the tensions between the Kirin Tor, who are now an overtly Alliance faction, and the Sun Reavers that we covered in patch 5.1, now that the Sun Reavers fully allied themselves with the Blood Elves. Now, both sides kick off the patch with an assault on the island, which is told in the form of a scenario. Blizzard basically used this patch as a test of whether the scenario tech could be used to deliver scripted single-player content in a way that would allow for a more tailored experience. Then, after securing our tenuous foothold on the island, the first set of daily quests unlocked, and each day you would be sent to a few of the total pool of daily quest areas, and then as you completed these quests, your server would actually progress the siege of the island, and then every time you filled up that progression bar, a new scenario, a story scenario, would be unlocked for you to do. This would push the story forward and also unlock new quest areas on the island, as well as lead to the construction of permanent bases for the Kirin and Sunreavers on the island. Now, while I was more invested in the actual plot of the 5.1 story, these quests were of a higher quality, and they definitely proved that Blizzard's scenario tech could be used for more than just the 3-player queued PvE content that they initially launched with. Now, the story was split between our efforts to thwart the forces of Lei Shen and the Zandalari, as well as skirmish with the other faction, and this really led to some actually good character moments. And take note here, Blizzard, they did not require a big flashy cinematic or anything like that. All they needed was some good dialogue, and it just worked. All the while, the Shadow Pan, led by Taran Zu, acted as a mediating force, imploring us to set aside our differences, hug it out and deal with the actual problem that we faced. Overall, it was a pretty damn engaging slate of content that would keep you invested in the game for a good few weeks. But then the island itself had more to offer than just these quests. There was a chance for you to get a key after completing your dailies. This key would take you into a special scenario, the Trove of the Thunder King. It was an Indiana Jones-style raid on an ancient tomb, complete with traps, guards to sneak past, and puzzles to solve. You basically had to make your way through with precision, striking a balance between speed, grabbing loot, and progressing further, trying to beat the timer and get to the end. Chests could contain gold, bonus roll currency, other minor rewards, and the chest keys as well. Now, these keys that you find inside the chests were important because when the timer ran out, your Shadowpan allies would yank you out of the trove and you'd be left in the final treasure room. Here you would open as many of those final chests as you had keys, and these could contain loads of gold, various useful items, as well as a pretty rare chance to get some gear. This was one of the coolest bits of content that World of Warcraft, in my view, had ever had. It was crammed with creativity and challenge. Just a truly fantastic, unique addition that genuinely felt different to most of the day-to-day content that you did. Normally having, one such bit of content like the treasure trove is, you count yourself lucky. Not the case here. We have the Warlock Greenfire quest, easily one of the best bits of class content to ever be put into the game. It had a really cool questline, the sort of brilliant infiltration scenario of the Black Temple, and then a final fight which was a perfect challenge for Warlocks. It was completely tailored to their class mechanics, it forced you to fully play the class, and it was brilliantly tuned. 5.2 also brought a new take on rare mobs. They were fewer in number but with greater difficulty, and this mainly worked as a way to break up what you were doing while you were questing. A rare mob would spawn, you drop what you were doing and you just run over to kill it, and that helped to break up the pace. Then, of course, moving on to the PvE front in terms of group stuff, it had one of the best damn raids in the game. Throne of Thunder was a fantastic instance that featured a range of bosses that had pretty damn different feeling mechanics, topped off with Lei Shen, who was one of the finest raid bosses the game had ever had. At the time, Lei Shen was actually considered to pretty much be the best heroic end boss that was in the game, ever. Of course, it wasn't completely perfect. Tuning was a bit off at the start, with 10-player being overtuned for the first few weeks. Definitely an example of the differences between 10 and 25-player boss design when they're trying to maintain an equal difficulty between the two, and how, group size, the availability of a wide range of utility options and all that stuff just impacts balance. And then later on, some of the bosses, like say the twin sisters, or were they sisters? I don't think they were sisters. No, it was twin consorts. You better hope they're not sisters. Anyway, that was a pretty easy fight that maybe should have been a bit earlier on in the progression. But overall, it was a fantastic raid and one that I was heavily invested in at the time. The Legendary Quest was of course involved, and this time we had a great scenario which was a leg up over the previous Legendary Quest content. That said, this patch did bring a very controversial system that we very much feel today, Thunder Forging. Some gear would drop at a slightly higher item level. Now, it's funny thinking about the reaction to it back then, given how much more variability the current Titan Forging system has. I think it's fair to say that it wasn't ideal for the heroic raiders, but it probably wasn't a terrible thing for the other difficulty levels at the time. This patch also removed the item level upgrades, though Valor points were still very important, with the new Shadowpan Assault faction offering gear rewards that were tied into reputation, rep that you would earn by doing the raid. And this was a great design because it meant that as you progress through the raid, yeah, sure, maybe you got a bit unlucky, you didn't get any gear, but you knew you were working at that rep and you would get some sort of reward. And really it says everything that I've been talking about 5.2 for ages here, and we're still not done. It also added the Isle of Giants. This place was just packed full of elite dinosaurs that you could kill for their bones. Bones which you could then turn in for some pretty cool cosmetic rewards at a vendor. This island was also home to what was, in my view, the best world boss of Mists, Undasta. It was a massive boss, often requiring 2-3 full raid groups to take it down in the earlier days. It was absolute carnage. His AoE abilities would just decimate hordes of players who didn't understand what was going on. It was awesome, in my view, but it was also heavily criticized at the time. I think for me, really, it was one of those things, it was just such an epic scale that only an MMO could do it, and I think it was good to have in the game. Of course, the other world bosses like Galleon, Sha of Anger, and Nalak, they were all pretty much worth it. Sure, not all of their gear was ideal, but a lot of them were very relevant to the mount collectors, with I'm sure many people still running the Sha to this day trying to get that mount. Really, patch 5.2 was massive. Massive to a level that, really, patches just don't come close to, really. It was probably larger than patch 5.4, it was definitely larger than 6.2 and 7.2, and in terms of running time, I think it might actually be longer than 7.3. Kind of amazing, really. And it's around this time that the broad story of MoP sort of changes. 5.0 and 5.1 were marred by massive sub-losses. Q3 2013, which ended a few days after this patch launched, was a loss of 1.3 million from the prior quarter. The first full quarter of patch 5.2's life, Q2 2013, was a smaller loss of 600k. That's not great, but things were beginning to turn around. 2 months later, patch 5.3 arrived, and this is a strange one. Much like 5.4 that would eventually follow it, 5.3 was quite experimental. Rather than make a bunch of content and slap it into the game, they instead tried to build a dynamic feeling war zone, something that would really capture in gameplay the narrative that was going on at the time. Let's talk about that narrative. Both factions had an introductory questline, with the Hordes being far more interesting. Garrosh had angered the other Horde leaders, especially Vol'jin with, that little cheeky assassination, which led to an open rebellion. We were basically supposed to be foot soldiers in this fight, tasked with clearing the barrens of hostile forces, intercepting supply caravans, and killing the enemy leaders. Blizzard's goal was to sell the fantasy of a ground war in a way that was far more tangible than the daily quests of 5.1. The content structure was a lot more freeform. Enemy bases just sort of existed out there in the wild, and you'd have to go there and, well, start killing. Structure did come in the form of weekly quests and also events, such as Kor'kron commanders who would spawn in from time to time, and defeating them would actually require a handful of players. Then also supply caravans would spawn in from time to time. The combination of all of these things made it feel a little bit more dynamic than what we had been used to in World of Warcraft, but it undeniably was rather sparse. I would love to see them revisit this idea though and really bring it to the next level with properly dynamic, cooperative content. Think of a sort of a PvE Ashran, but a lot wider, less of a straight tug of war, and with some daily directed content. I think there could be something pretty cool in that idea. The other headline feature was heroic scenarios. These were actually not tuned for a pug, you had to do them in a pre-made group. And they were still kind of easy, but they did pose enough of a threat for, moderately geared players to sort of have to pay attention, at least. And they fast became the way to get VP capped for a week as well, so they were actually done quite a lot. Basically, the regular scenarios, I thought they were a bit of a dud, but these were of a decent enough quality. Then PvP players also found themselves with a new battleground, something that has not happened since, almost 5 years later. I feel bad for the PvP players. And then they also had a new arena, which is pretty sweet as well. Finally, the legendary quest had a new leg to it that ended up being really cool. It had a role-specific challenge. Now, sure, these weren't hard, but they were, I think, a pretty fantastic addition. And in terms of storytelling, this and the content of 5.2 were really the best that we had seen with the legendary quest. It was a pretty good example of Blizzard taking us on a journey and really having us spend time with Rathian, who is fast becoming one of the more interesting characters in the game. It's just a shame about some of that raid drop RNG, but hey, what can you do? While it very much felt like a prototype when you look at 5.3, its ideas are worthy of merit and the goals I think are laudable. Perhaps we will see the full potential of an in-game war be realized someday. And let's end today's video by checking in with the subscriber count, because this is the real story. While the game did post a loss, the quarter of patch 5.3's introduction was only a loss of 100k, a massive decrease from all that had happened before it. All the while, Blizzard were adamant that these losses were primarily from Asia, which at the time seemed like an excuse to me, but I have been able to since independently verify the veracity of that with a primary source outside of Blizzard, though obviously I don't want to get anyone in trouble, so we're going to leave that one there. But really, things were looking up for World of Warcraft, and at the time, there was great hope that Blizzard could turn the tide. Assuming you were invested in Mists of Pandaria, it really felt like Blizzard were taking good care of you. There was a lot of patch content coming out, and it's fair to say that at this time, the game was in a very, very healthy spot after, the expansion did initially struggle to find its footing. So, join me next time for the breakdown of patch 5.4, something that would be the template for future outdoor content, and, of course, the breakdown of Mists of Pandaria's legacy, which is something that really has lasted long into the future. It's funny that the expansion, which was a departure from the traditional storytelling of World of Warcraft, basically an expansion of the RTS, is also the expansion where Blizzard really started to get creative, to tell their own stories, and to really play around with what a World of Warcraft patch was, with each one of this expansion's patches having quite a lot of iteration and experimentation within it. But that's it for this video. If you'd like to support content like this that's a bit more long form, consider checking out the Patreon, and a massive thanks to those guys. They really helped get this content out. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.